The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the ancient hemlocks surrounding Silas's cabin, a sound like a low, mournful cello echoing across the frozen landscape of the Cascade Mountains. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke, gun oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of solitude that only a man who has spent a decade in exile can truly understand. Silas sat by the wood stove, his hands, calloused and mapped with scars from a war that the world had tried to forget, wrapped around a mug of bitter coffee. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a ghost, a remnant of the soldier he used to be before the noise of humanity became too much for him to bear. He lived by a clock that didn't tick, governed only by the rising sun and the deepening shadows of the valley. For Silas, the silence was a fortress, a barrier he had meticulously built to keep the nightmares of the front lines at bay. He had chosen this remote corner of the United States because the trees didn't ask questions and the mountain didn't care about the medals he had buried in a rusted tin box beneath the floorboards. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. It was heavy, expectant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath in anticipation of a rupture. The snow was piling up against the door, sealing him in his self-imposed tomb, and for the first time in years, the veteran felt a strange, inexplicable prickle at the base of his neck. It was the old survival instinct, the one that had kept him alive in the jungles half a world away. Screaming that something was watching, he stood up, his knees popping with the protest of age and old injuries, and moved toward the window, peering out into the swirling white void. The moon was a pale, obscured coin in the sky, offering just enough light to see the silhouettes of the pines swaying like giants in agony. There was nothing out there but the cold and the dark, yet Silas couldn't shake the feeling of a presence, a weight pressing against the perimeter of his isolated world. He checked the bolt on the door, a habit born of paranoia, and returned to his chair, telling himself it was just the wind playing tricks on a mind that had spent too long in its own company. But then it happened, a sound that shattered the logic of the storm. It wasn't the scratching of a branch or the thud of falling ice. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sequence of knocks. 3 heavy, desperate thuds against the thick oak of his door, vibrating through the wood and into the very soles of his feet. Silas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended in violence. No one came up this far in winter, not hikers, not rangers, and certainly not the few neighbors who lived miles down the trail. He reached for the hunting knife on the mantel, his grip steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins, and approached the door with the silent, predatory grace of a man trained to kill. "Who's out there?" he called out, his voice raspy from days of disuse, sounding foreign even to his own ears. There was no verbal reply, only a low, guttural moan that sounded like a sob, followed by a heavy slide against the door, as if someone or something had just collapsed against it. Silas hesitated, his finger hovering over the latch, torn between the instinct to defend his sanctuary and a sudden, overwhelming surge of human curiosity. He had seen enough death to know its many sounds, and this sound was the unmistakable cadence of the end. With a sharp intake of breath, he threw the bolt and pulled the door open, bracing himself for an attacker. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a wall of frost that momentarily blinded him, but as his eyes adjusted, he didn't see a man or a monster. Slumped on his porch, her black fur matted with frozen blood and dusted with white snow, was a Black Panther, her breathing ragged and shallow in the frigid air. She was massive, a shadow-given flesh, but her power was eclipsed by the sheer desperation radiating from her broken form. Silas stared, paralyzed by the impossibility of the sight, his mind struggling to reconcile the predator before him with the creature that was clearly dying at his feet. She looked up at him, and in the amber glow of the cabin's light, Silas saw her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a mother. They were wide, glassy with pain, and filled with a silent, agonizing plea for mercy that Silas had only seen once before, in the eyes of a young corporal he had tried to save in a muddy trench years ago. The panther's flank was torn open, a jagged wound that leaked dark crimson onto the pristine snow, and her belly was swollen, heavy with the life she was carrying. She didn't growl, didn't bared her teeth. She simply laid her head down on the threshold, her golden eyes locked onto his, as if she knew that he was her last and only hope. The veteran felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with the cold. This was a violation of every law of nature he knew, a predator seeking sanctuary from a man, yet the connection was undeniable. He saw her shivering, the light in her eyes flickering like a candle in a gale, and he knew that if he closed the door, she would be a frozen husk by dawn. The logic of his isolation told him to stay out of it, to let nature take its course, but the soldier in him, the man who had sworn an oath to protect life even when surrounded by death, couldn't turn away. "Easy, girl," he whispered, the words puffing in the air as he dropped the knife. He realized he was talking to a wild animal, as if she could understand him, but the panther's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. He reached out a hand, a gesture of absolute madness, and touched the top of her head. Her fur was coarse and freezing, but beneath it he could feel the frantic drumming heat of her heart. She let out a soft, huffing breath, a surrender of pride that broke something inside Silas's hardened chest. He stepped back, clearing a path into the warmth of the cabin. "Come on," he urged, gesturing to the rug near the wood stove. The panther struggled to rise, her back legs slipping on the ice, but with a monumental effort that must have cost her everything, she dragged herself across the threshold. Silas watched in stunned silence as the great cat hauled her injured body into his home, leaving a trail of blood on his pine floors. She collapsed near the fire, the heat causing steam to rise from her damp coat, and let out a long, shuddering sigh that filled the small room. Silas shut the door and bolted it, locking the world out and the impossible in. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the predator in his living room. The cabin, once a place of stagnant peace, was now a theater of life and death. He realized then that the panther hadn't just knocked on his door. She had knocked on the door of his humanity, a door he thought he had boarded up forever. He looked at his medical kit, the one he kept for emergencies because the nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and felt the old focus returning, the cold, sharp clarity of a combat medic under fire. He didn't have a choice anymore. The war had followed him home, but this time the enemy was death itself. The night was just beginning, and as Silas moved toward the dying animal with bandages and antiseptic, he felt a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in a decade. He was no longer a hermit hiding from his shadows. He was a guardian again. Outside, the storm continued to rage, burying the cabin in layers of white, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of a miracle in the making. He knelt beside the panther, his shadow stretching long against the wall, and began the work of saving a life that the world would never believe existed. The first hour was a dance with death, a delicate balance between the panther's fading strength and Silas's limited resources. He worked with a precision that bypassed his conscious mind, his fingers moving through the black fur to inspect the wound on her haunch. It was deep, likely from a jagged rock or a fallen branch during her desperate flight through the storm, and it was still weeping blood. Every time he touched her, he expected a snap of jaws or a swipe of claws, but the panther remained eerily still, her breathing a rhythmic wheeze that vibrated through the floorboards. She watched him with a terrifying intelligence, her pupils dilated, tracking every movement of his hands as he cleaned the laceration. As he stitched the wound with a curved needle and fishing line, the only thread strong enough for such a task, Silas felt the weight of his own history pressing down on him. Each stitch felt like a stitch in his own soul, a repair of the countless things he had seen broken and couldn't fix. He remembered the chaos of the field hospitals, the smell of burnt ozone and copper, and the faces of men he had failed. Here in the quiet of the Cascades, he was attempting a different kind of salvation. The panther let out a low, mournful growl when the needle pierced her skin, but she didn't move to strike. She seemed to understand that his pain was a precursor to healing. The tension in the room was suffocating, a silent dialogue between two creatures who should have been enemies. Silas found himself talking to her, his voice a low murmur that served to steady his own nerves as much as hers. He told her about the mountain, about the seasons he had watched pass in solitude, and about the quiet that he had mistaken for peace. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone with his thoughts, and the realization was both terrifying and liberating. The panther's presence was a physical force, a wildness that challenged the stagnant air of his cabin and forced him to confront the reality of the living world outside his walls. As the night deepened, the panther's labor began in earnest. Her body rippled with contractions, and her golden eyes clouded over with a different kind of agony. Silas watched, helpless for a moment, as the predator he had just stitched together began the ancient, grueling process of bringing new life into a world that offered her no quarter. He saw her muscles bunch and release, her claws digging into his expensive wool rug, tearing the fibers in a display of raw, natural power. He knew nothing of feline birth, but he knew the signs of distress, and he could see that the panther was exhausted, her reserves spent from the cold and the injury. Outside, the wind screamed, a reminder of the harsh reality they were both trying to escape. Silas felt a surge of anger at the world, at the hunters who would have shot her on sight, at the encroaching towns that pushed her further into the margins, and at the fate that had brought her to his door in such a state. He realized that his isolation was a luxury she didn't have. She was a part of the world, fighting for every breath, while he had been merely existing. He reached out to stroke her head again, a gesture of solidarity, and felt the heat of her fever. She was burning up, her body fighting the infection and the strain of the coming kits. He began to boil water, his mind jumping to the few books he had on local wildlife and general medicine. He was a man of action, but this was a territory where action felt futile against the tide of biology. He brought warm towels to her, wiping the sweat and grime from her face, acting as a midwife to a creature that could kill him with a single bite. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his youth learning how to take lives with maximum efficiency, and now he was using every ounce of his will to ensure that a litter of predators could be born in his living room. The panther leaned into his touch, a heartbreaking display of trust that made Silas's throat tighten. Throughout the small hours of the morning, the cabin became a sanctuary of shared struggle. Silas found himself reflecting on his own family, or the lack thereof. He had no children, no wife, no one to carry on his name or remember his face once the mountain eventually claimed him. He had chosen this, he reminded himself, but the panther's labor made his choice feel like a hollow victory. She was risking everything for her lineage, for the continuation of her kind, while he had been content to let his own story end in a quiet, snowy cabin. The contrast was a bitter pill, and it forced him to look at his own reflection in the darkened window with a new sense of distaste. The air in the cabin grew thick with the smell of musk and birth, a primal scent that stripped away the veneer of Silas's civilized life. He was no longer a veteran or a hermit. He was simply a living being in the presence of another, bound by the universal law of survival. He watched the panther's belly heave, and for a moment he feared she wouldn't make it. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Silas knelt by her side, pressing his hand against her side to feel the kits moving within, and for a fleeting second he felt a connection so deep it transcended species. It was the pulse of the earth itself, ancient and unstoppable. Then a complication arose. The panther's breathing stopped for a terrifyingly long interval, her eyes rolling back in her head. Silas panicked, his combat training kicking in as he checked for an airway obstruction or a sign of shock. He realized that the first kit was stuck, a malposition that would surely kill both mother and offspring if left unaddressed. His hands shook as he reached for a clean towel, knowing that he was about to do something that defied every survival instinct he possessed. He would have to manually assist the birth, reaching into the maw of the predator's pain to pull life from the brink of death. "Look at me, girl," he commanded, his voice firm and authoritative, the tone he used when directing men through a minefield. The panther's eyes snapped to his, focusing through the haze of pain. "I need you to stay with me. I'm going to help you, but you can't bite me. Do you hear me? You stay with me." It was an absurd request, but the cat seemed to go still, a strange calm settling over her massive frame. She let out a soft whine, her claws retracting from the rug, and Silas took that as her consent. He moved with a heavy heart and a steady hand, entering the fray of her labor with the desperation of a man seeking his own salvation. The struggle was visceral and messy, a literal tug-of-war with fate. Silas worked with a feverish intensity, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold outside. He could feel the small, fragile life within the mother, a tiny spark that was rapidly cooling. He guided, he pushed, and he prayed, a word he hadn't used in earnest since the day he left the service. He pleaded with whatever gods watched over the wild places to give this mother a break, to let this one thing go right in a world where so much had gone wrong. The panther groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed through the rafters. Finally, with a wet, sliding sound and a final, desperate heave from the mother, the first kit was born. It was a tiny, slick bundle of black fur, motionless and cold. Silas caught it in a warm towel, his heart sinking as he saw no movement, no sign of the breath that would signal life. He began to rub the small body vigorously, just as he had seen in old films, his large hands nearly swallowing the tiny creature. "Come on," he hissed, his voice cracking. "Don't you dare quit on me now. Breathe, damn you, breathe!" The panther watched him, her eyes wide and haunting as the veteran fought for the life of a creature he had known for only a few hours. The silence that followed the birth was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the cabin. Silas didn't stop, his fingers working rhythmically to stimulate the kit's lungs, his mind a whirlwind of grief and stubbornness. He couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't let the night finish with another death on his conscience. And then it happened, a tiny, high-pitched sneeze, followed by a weak, mewling cry that sounded like the most beautiful symphony Silas had ever heard. The kit shivered, its mouth opening to take in the warm air of the cabin, and Silas felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him over. He placed the kit near the mother's head, and she immediately began to lick it with a fierce, possessive tenderness. But the night wasn't over. The panther was still in labor, and the strain was beginning to take a visible toll on her heart. Silas could see the irregular beat in her chest, the way her muscles were starting to tremor with exhaustion. 2 more kits were born in quick succession, smaller but healthy, their cries joining the first in a chaotic chorus of new life. Silas handled each one with a reverence he hadn't felt for anything in years, cleaning them and placing them in the warmth of their mother's flank. For a moment, it seemed like the miracle was complete, that the storm had been weathered and the danger had passed. Then the atmospheric pressure in the cabin seemed to shift. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the panther, a sound that wasn't a purr or a growl, but something more primal, more ancient. The air grew cold, despite the roaring fire, and Silas felt a strange, tingling sensation on his skin. He looked at the panther and saw that her golden eyes were no longer amber. They were glowing with a soft, ethereal light that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wounds he had stitched were no longer bleeding. They were shimmering with a faint, silvery luminescence that seemed to be knitting the flesh back together at an impossible speed. Silas backed away, his heart racing with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown. He had seen many things in the war, things that defied logic and morality, but he had never seen the supernatural. The panther stood up, her movements fluid and effortless, the injury that had nearly killed her seemingly forgotten. She looked larger, more majestic, her fur shimmering like polished obsidian in the firelight. She turned her gaze toward Silas, and for a moment the walls of the cabin seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast, celestial landscape where time and space had no meaning. He felt his mind being pulled into a vortex of memories and visions. He saw the faces of the men he had lost, not as corpses in the mud, but as spirits walking through a golden field. He felt the weight of his guilt being lifted, as if 1,000 hands were reaching out to brush away the soot of his past. He heard a voice, not in his ears, but in his soul, a voice that was both the rustle of leaves and the roar of a waterfall. "The circle is mended," the voice whispered, a promise of peace that Silas had never thought possible. He saw his own life, a long, winding path through shadow and light, and he realized that every moment of pain had led him to this cabin, to this door, to this night. The vision was so intense that Silas fell to his knees, his breath hitching in his throat. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation of being seen and understood by something far greater than himself. The panther approached him, her steps silent on the floorboards, and lowered her head until her nose touched his forehead. In that contact, Silas felt a surge of energy, a transfer of strength and ancient wisdom that filled the hollow places in his heart. He saw the future of the Kits, guardians of the forest, symbols of a wildness that could never be tamed, and he saw his own future, no longer a hermit, but a bridge between worlds. Suddenly, the light faded, and the cabin returned to its mundane reality. The fire was low, the smell of cedar and musk remained, and the panther was once again a physical creature of fur and bone. But the change was permanent. She was healed, and her kits were thriving. She looked at Silas one last time, a look of profound, silent gratitude that transcended language. She then began to gather her kits, her movements purposeful and protective. Silas watched, unable to find words, as the predator who had knocked on his door prepared to return to the wild. The impossible had happened, and the man who thought his life was over had been given a new beginning. But as the panther moved toward the door, Silas realized that the world outside had changed too. The storm had stopped with a suddenness that was jarring, and the air was perfectly still. He opened the door for her, and instead of a wall of snow, he was met by a landscape bathed in an eerie silver light. The trees were glowing, their needles shimmering with the same luminescence he had seen on the panther's wounds. The entire forest seemed to be awake, a living, breathing entity that was celebrating the return of its queen. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the cold no longer biting, but feeling like a fresh, invigorating embrace. The panther stepped out into the night, her kits tucked safely in her mouth one by one as she moved them to a hidden cache beneath the cabin's crawlspace for a final moment of rest. She then returned to Silas, leaning her heavy shoulder against his leg in a final, heartbreaking gesture of affection. He reached down and buried his hands in her thick fur, feeling the heat and the power of the life he had helped save. He knew that this story would never be told, that no one would believe the word of a lonely veteran in the woods. But it didn't matter. The truth was etched into his soul, and the silence of the forest was no longer a void, but a conversation. As the first hints of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, the panther turned and vanished into the trees, a shadow merging with shadows. Silas stood on his porch, watching the spot where she had disappeared, his heart full for the first time in a decade. He looked at his hands, the hands that had stitched a predator and held the sparks of new life, and he saw that they were no longer shaking. The war was finally over. The nightmares had been replaced by a miracle, and the man who had hidden from the world was ready to face it again, even if only on his own terms. However, the shock promised by the night wasn't over. As Silas turned to go back inside, he noticed something on the threshold where the panther had first collapsed. Lying in the snow was a small, perfectly formed stone, glowing with a faint, pulse-like light. He picked it up, and the moment his skin touched the surface, he felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't a stone. It was a fragment of something celestial, a gift from the entity that had inhabited the panther. He realized then that he hadn't just saved an animal. He had played a role in a cosmic alignment, a moment where the veil between worlds had worn thin enough to touch. The final revelation came as he looked toward the valley. The lights of the distant town seemed brighter, closer, and for the first time they didn't look like a threat. They looked like a community he had once belonged to. Silas sat back down in his chair, the glowing stone in his hand, and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The forest was no longer silent. It was humming with the sound of the kits, the wind, and the heartbeat of a man who had finally found his way home. The break in his life had been mended, and the consequences of this night would ripple out through the trees for generations to come. The days following the miraculous night were a blur of transformation for Silas. The cabin, once a sterile environment of routine and isolation, now felt like a temple. He found himself cleaning with a renewed vigor, washing away the blood of the birth, but keeping the memory of it fresh in his mind. The glowing stone sat on his mantle, a constant reminder that the world was far more complex and beautiful than his cynicism had allowed him to believe. He noticed that the local wildlife began to behave differently toward him. Deer would graze near his porch without fear, and hawks would circle low over his chimney as if acknowledging a fellow guardian. His physical health also began to change in ways he couldn't explain. The chronic pain in his knees and the stiffness in his back, remnants of jumps and rucks from his soldiering days, simply vanished. He felt a lightness in his step and a clarity in his vision that he hadn't experienced since his early 20s. It was as if the touch of the panther, or the entity within her, had scrubbed his cells clean of the trauma and wear of his past life. He started eating better, taking long walks into the deeper woods, no longer looking for threats, but observing the intricate tapestry of the ecosystem he was now a part of. The emotional impact was even more profound. The wall of anger he had built around his heart had crumbled, leaving him vulnerable but alive. He found himself thinking of his family, his sister in Ohio, his old friends from the unit, and for the first time he felt a desire to reach out. The isolation that had been his armor was now just a lonely room. He realized that the panther had shown him that even the most powerful and solitary creatures need help, and that there is no shame in the asking or the giving. This realization was a quiet earthquake, shifting the foundations of his identity and forcing him to rebuild his sense of self. In the forest, the panther's presence was a lingering scent on the wind. Silas would often find signs of her, a paw print in the mud, a tuft of black fur on a briar, and he felt a sense of kinship that replaced the crushing loneliness of his previous years. He knew she was out there, raising her kits with the strength he had helped preserve, and the thought gave him a sense of purpose that no medal ever could. He became a silent protector of the land, removing old traps he found, and ensuring that the water sources remained clean. He was no longer just a resident of the woods, he was their steward. However, the supernatural elements of that night had a lingering effect on the environment. The area around Silas's cabin began to bloom with flowers that shouldn't have been in season, and the trees grew with a lushness that defied the harsh mountain climate. Rumors began to circulate in the town below about the miracle of the North Peak. People spoke of a man who lived with spirits and a black cat that guarded the mountain. Silas heard these whispers when he went into town for supplies, and instead of retreating in annoyance, he simply smiled a secret, knowing smile. He had become a legend in his own time, a ghost story with a heartbeat. The dynamic between Silas and the townspeople began to shift as well. He was no longer the crazy hermit to be avoided. He became a figure of quiet respect. When he spoke, people listened, sensing a weight of wisdom that transcended his years. He found himself helping a young veteran at the local diner, sharing stories of the mountain rather than the war, and offering a hand that didn't just hold a weapon, but held hope. The Panther had taught him that the bravest act isn't the one done in the heat of battle, but the one done in the quiet of a snowy night, choosing compassion over fear. But with the beauty came a new kind of tension. Silas knew that the world would eventually come for the Panther. He saw the survey stakes for a new logging road moving closer to his perimeter and felt a protective rage he had to learn to manage. He realized that his role had evolved. He was now the buffer between the ancient magic of the forest and the relentless march of human progress. He spent his evenings studying land use laws and environmental protections, using his military discipline to fight a new kind of war, one fought with petitions and legal standing rather than bullets. One evening, Silas found himself back at the threshold where the Panther had knocked. The wood was still stained a faint pink, a permanent mark of the night that changed everything. He sat on the porch, the glowing stone in his pocket, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the break that had occurred in his life. The rupture had allowed the light to get in, and that light was now reflecting off everything he touched. He was a man transformed, a soldier who had finally found a cause worth living for, and a hermit who had rediscovered the meaning of the word neighbor. The kits, now several weeks old, began to make appearances. Silas would see them from a distance, 3 black shadows playing in the undergrowth, while their mother watched from a high, rocky outcrop. He never tried to approach them or domesticate them. He respected the boundary they had established. The Panther would occasionally meet his eyes from across the clearing, a silent acknowledgement of the debt and the bond that remained between them. They were 2 survivors of different wars, standing on the same ground, connected by a night of blood and starlight. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Silas felt a sense of completion. The consequences of the night weren't just the survival of the Panther and her kits, but the survival of Silas himself. He had been rescued from the slow death of his own despair. He started a small garden, planting seeds in the rich mountain soil, a gesture of faith in the future that he hadn't possessed for a long time. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a home, a place of stories and life, but he also knew that the Panther's story was part of something larger. The glowing stone was becoming more active, pulsing with a frequency that seemed to be calling out to something deep within the mountain. Silas felt a premonition that his journey with the supernatural was just beginning. He wasn't afraid. He had faced the greatest predator in the forest and found a friend. Whatever was coming next, he would face it with the same steady hands and open heart that had saved a mother and her young. The silence was gone, replaced by a symphony of growth and the quiet, powerful breath of the wild. He ended the day by writing in a journal, a gift to the sister he had finally called. He didn't tell her about the glowing stone or the Panther's eyes, but he told her that he was okay. He told her that he had found something on the mountain that he thought he had lost forever. He realized that the greatest consequence of answering that knock was the realization that he was still capable of love, not just for a creature of the woods, but for the life he had been given. The veteran was finally home, and the forest was no longer just trees, but a family. The final transition came on a night when the moon was full and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming wild jasmine. Silas was sitting on his porch, the glowing stone now a constant source of warmth in his pocket, when he felt a familiar presence. The Panther didn't knock this time. She simply stepped out of the shadows and sat at the edge of his porch, her kits, now sturdy and playful, tumbling around her feet. She looked healthy, her coat glossy and her eyes clear of the pain that had defined their first meeting. She looked at Silas, and then she looked toward the highest peak of the mountain, where the light of the moon seemed to concentrate in a single, brilliant pillar. Silas understood. The time had come for the Panther to return to the deeper parts of the wild, perhaps to a place where the veil between worlds was even thinner. He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the great cat. He didn't need words to say goodbye. The bond they shared was beyond the reach of language. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the glowing stone, holding it out in his open palm. The panther touched it with her nose, and for a brief second, the entire clearing was illuminated in a soft golden light that made the trees look like they were made of glass. The stone dissolved into a fine, shimmering dust that Silas blew into the wind, watching as it scattered like tiny stars across the clearing. He felt a final, profound sense of peace settle over him, a realization that his work as a guardian was being validated and expanded. The panther let out a low, resonant purr that vibrated in Silas's chest, a sound of absolute completion. She then turned and led her kits toward the high peak, their silhouettes disappearing into the silver light of the moon. Silas watched them go, not with sadness, but with a deep, abiding joy. As the morning sun began to rise, Silas found himself standing in a forest that felt entirely new. The survey stakes for the logging road had been mysteriously moved, and the plans for the development were later tied up in legal challenges that would protect the peak for decades to come. Silas had become the official Keeper of the North Peak, a title given to him by the town, but earned on that snowy night. He spent his days teaching local children about the importance of the wild, sharing stories that blended history with a touch of the miraculous, ensuring that the next generation would respect the silence as he had. The cabin was no longer a place of isolation, but a center of community. People from the town would bring him coffee and news, and in return he would offer them the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen the face of a miracle. He reconnected with his sister, and she eventually came to visit, her children playing on the same porch where a panther had once collapsed in desperation. Silas would watch them and think of the kits on the mountain, knowing that the cycle of life was once again in balance. The war was a distant memory, a shadow that served only to make the light of his current life feel brighter. The final shock for Silas came years later, when he was an old man, resting in his chair by the fire. He heard a soft sound at the door, not a knock, but a gentle scratch. He opened it to find a young, powerful Black Panther standing there, its eyes a familiar shade of amber. It wasn't the mother, but one of the kits he had helped bring into the world, now a majestic ruler of the forest in its own right. The cat didn't ask for help. It simply looked at him for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had answered the door when no one else would. Silas smiled, his heart full, and watched as the panther leaped back into the trees. He knew then that his legacy was secure. He hadn't just saved a life, he had saved a lineage of magic and wildness that would guard the mountain long after he was gone. He sat back down and closed his eyes, the sound of the forest a lullaby that spoke of redemption, mercy, and the incredible power of a single act of courage. He was Silas, the veteran, the hermit, the guardian, and the man who had been brave enough to open his door to the dark. The story of the Black Panther and the veteran became a local legend, a tale told to remind people that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places. It was a story about how a man who thought his purpose was over discovered that his greatest mission was just beginning. It was a reminder that the world is full of knocks we often ignore, but that the ones we choose to answer can change the course of our lives forever. Silas's cabin remained a beacon on the hill, a symbol of the thin line between the human and the divine. In the end, the forest was never silent again. It was filled with the stories of those who survived, the whispers of the trees, and the heartbeat of a man who found his soul in the eyes of a predator. Silas passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on the spot where the glowing stone had once been. The townspeople say that on the night of his funeral, 3 Black Panthers were seen standing on the ridge above the cabin, watching the procession with a solemn, silent respect. They were the guardians he had fostered, the living evidence of a night that shocked everyone but saved a man. The cabin still stands, weathered by time, but held together by the memories of the miracle. The woods are still thick, the peaks are still high, and the legend of Silas and his visitor remains a part of the American landscape. It serves as a testament to the fact that redemption isn't something you find, it's something you earn through mercy. And for those who are brave enough to listen, the mountain still speaks of the night when a knock on the door turned a lonely veteran into a hero of a different kind of war, the war for the heart of the wild. The forest continues to thrive, protected by a magic that defies explanation and a history that is rooted in a single desperate plea for help. The Black Panthers are still seen occasionally, shadows in the moonlight, a reminder of the night the world's rules were suspended for the sake of compassion. And as the wind howls through the hemlocks, it no longer sounds like a mournful cello. It sounds like a song of survival, a melody of the man who opened his door and found that the bravest act isn't fighting. It's answering the call of the broken.